Welcome to our fourth seminar of our working group. And today we have a presentation of Matthew Holstein, and he's the assistant research professor in Business Families in the Legal Society. Yes, everybody knows him. And he will present a great presentation on intersection between international relations and democracy studies. Awesome, thanks, AJ. Hey everybody, thanks for coming. I'd like to meet you. My name is Matt Honstein. I work at the Lucy Family Institute. My background is in political science, specifically political violence, transitions from violent conflict. So what I want to talk to you about today is a research agenda that I'm working on that looks at how we implement power sharing after civil war and how it affects both conflict management, which I think is maybe less of interest for this group, but I'll touch on anyway, and maybe more of interest downstream democratization, so transitions to election quality, and authoritarian consolidation in the post-war period. And a preview. That's tricky. Got it. Okay. So that's a research question, right? What type of power sharing do we implement after civil war? With the meeting people and a lot to do. Okay. What forms of power sharing do we implement after war ends, and how does this affect war recurrence? Rebel group structure, but also how does this affect post-war politics? So how does the form of governments that we establish, we use these peace agreements to establish the direction of government in the post-war period. What do the long-term outcomes of that transitional government look like? How does that affect downstream things that we're interested in, like democracy, like the holding of elections? Sorry, Misha, I keep walking in front of this one. Don't stand still. Just can use. Okay, so I've structured the talk a little differently. The bulk of the research agenda is actually about this new typology of post-war power sharing. So I'm going to really dig in there and spend the bulk of my time talking about that. So I'm going to propose that we use a new typology to distinguish between different forms of power sharing, what I term short-term power sharing and permanent associationalism. And then I'm going to show you how I validated this new typology using natural language processing on a corpus of peace agreements that were established after civil war. And after I hopefully convinced you that these are two distinct forms of power sharing and not, as commonly assumed in the literature, the same thing, I'm going to talk about why we should care that there are two different forms of power sharing after war. And I'm going to use two applications for that. The first is going to look at rebel group splintering. So this is mostly completed work that looks at how rebel group cohesion is affected by the terms of the power sharing settlement. So if you get a power sharing government, what happens to your movement in the post-war period? And then a second application that's under development that looks at how this affects transitions to democracy. I like to start this talk, sorry to Valia, Dimitri, and Brian, who've seen this before, and have always seen the same example. I like to start this talk with a motivating example. So I use South Sudan's 2018 agreement, which I'll call RR. Acronym for the Revitalized Agreement on the Resolution of the Conflict in South Sudan. So RRs is kind of a good example of the type of power sharing that I'm interested in. So this is a 5-party agreement where the parties established a 3-year transitional government and were allowed to appoint members of their groups to just a huge range of positions in the post-war government. So we have 4 vice presidents, 1 for each of the former armed actors. And then between those 4 groups and the government, they were allowed to appoint a huge number of ministers, deputy ministers, legislators, and then they moved down from national level institutions to subnational institutions. So state level, and then even below the state level to county level appointments. The numbers weren't exact in the agreement because they didn't know how many states there were. Actually, one of the issues in dispute. So they used a formula to determine how they would divide the subsequent appointments between the 5 groups. So when I talk about temporary power sharing, I'm really interested in this type of agreement. In contrast, the broader literature on power sharing really doesn't talk very much to this type of short-term unity government. So we typically talk about power sharing over domains following Herzl and Hody. So we talk about political power sharing, economic power sharing, military power sharing, et cetera, et cetera. And when we drill down to political power sharing, we're really interested in permanent institutional reforms. And the reason that we care about this type of permanent power sharing in post-war societies is because what we're looking to do is allow groups to transition from armed actors to political actors. Right, so you can imagine during in a post-war environment, when you suggest to former armed actors that they need to disband and lay down their arms, that's a tough sell in an environment where up until maybe a few moments ago, the government was using forcible arms to repress you, right? And your only defense against that was your own forcible arms. So what we need to do is transition your temporary military power into permanent political power. And we do that through institutional reforms. And by giving you access to the political center, we ensure that the government can't be used as a tool to repress you again in the future, right? So fundamentally, when we're talking about permanent power sharing, here, we're talking about when we're talking about the permanent power sharing, institutional power sharing, what we're talking about is institutions that manage between group relations, right? So fundamentally, what we want to do is channel between group relations into formal institutional channels, give everybody access to the political center, and build trust around working together and not resorting to violence over political domain. So this is a well-established part of the conflict literature. And we have positive results about the impact of these on war recurrence. We think permanent political institutions limit war recurrence, and some, although contested work on whether these lead to democratization or not. Okay, so that's all well and good, but it's less effective when the transition doesn't work because okay, and that like the one timing thing that I did. Okay, so there's a problem. We're not doing this at all anymore, right? So this isn't the former Yugoslavia in the 90s anymore, when we were establishing a lot of these permanent post-war institutions to manage between group conflict. This is the new data that I'm going to present shortly, and it just shows the proportion of political power sharing agreements in peace agreements that use short-term unity governments versus permanent associationalism. And basically, since 2010, it's 90% above. So we have this really big literature on how permanent political institutions work in the post-war setting, but there's this big disconnect between what we're actually doing on the ground, what we're doing within these agreements, and how we are talking about these settlements in the literature. So what I propose in this stream of research is that we need to distinguish between these two types of power sharing. So what I'm going to term institutional power sharing, basically everything that everyone has talked about up until now is part of political power sharing. We're talking about permanent institutional reforms that enable kind of a like-part style grand coalition in the post-war government. So everybody gets access to the state, and in doing so, we can prevent violence. And what I'm really interested in is the second, which are short-term unity governments built by the former armed actors. And well, I described previously this idea that institutional power sharing is really about between group management, right? Between group relation management. What I argue in the paper and the research is that temporary power sharing is actually about within group management. It doesn't have anything to do with how we manage conflict between groups in the post-war setting. What it really does is allow rebel group leaders that are transitioning to political parties to manage their group by offering them positions in the post-war government to buy off, to reward loyalty in the transition period, right? And so I argue, and I hopefully will convince you that this distinction is fundamentally matters for how we talk about both resolving violence and kind of long-term political trajectory of these states, because these types of institutions are fundamentally doing different things. These types of power sharing are fundamentally meant to do different things. Okay. So in order to test some of these arguments, I collected new data on the form of power sharing in 314 peace agreements based on the UCDP peace agreement data. This is slightly less than the sample of the agreements because I could not find text anywhere for maybe say 15 of them. And so I did this old-fashioned way. I read them. I don't recommend it. And so down in the rest of the talk, you'll see that I'm going to get an LLM to read for me instead. So what I did is I distinguished between this kind of institutional power sharing that had to establish permanent reforms to the executive, to the legislature. So this is things like proportional representation in your legislature. This is things like multi-person executive versus the short-term power sharing, which had to be a time-bound unity government that incorporated the former armed actors and allowed them to make appointments into the unity government. And what I found is that the vast majority of these agreements use the latter form, what I just showed you in the prior slide. Okay. So having collected this data, I'm going to hopefully convince you that this is something that's quantitatively necessary in the sense that I can distinguish between this new measure of power sharing and prior measures of power sharing. Part of the reason I do that is because we have a bunch of existing measures of power sharing, and people are a little bit skeptical that they need to learn about another additional measure of power sharing. So what I'm going to show you is inter-rater reliability statistics. This is from Kappa between my new laser. No. Between my new measures down at the bottom and existing measures on the same data. The darker the cell, the higher the reliability. I'm using Cohen's kappa to account for chance concordance because the modal outcome in these agreements is no power sharing, right? So we could get really high agreement just because we don't have any kind of power sharing, right? So what I find is that institutional power sharing, so that's what we're talking about all the time, it theoretically basically doesn't map onto any of these existing measures, right? It has very low, you can call them correlation, there's very low reliability statistic, except maybe a very trivial one with the existing power sharing measure from UCDP. Temporary power sharing has modest correlations with some of the components, like a short-term government, which UCDP has a measure for, and the incorporation of former rebels in government, but they don't fully capture, those measures don't fully capture the concept that I'm talking about. So if you did intercode reliability and you got 0.5 back, you would likely tell your RAs to do it again, right? Until they had like 0.8 on intercode reliability. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I have maybe a clarifying question.
Sure.
Would you rather like me asking now or by the end?
Clarifying questions, yeah. Lecture doesn't kind of set up for that, but please, yeah.
Yeah, so like when you're talking about like temporary, are you like putting like some time bound? Like, so I know that usually they have like they usually say, right, on the agreement, so this is gonna work for 3, 4, 5 years and then, right?
That's right.
My question, I guess, is like about what happens after.
Yeah.
Right? What after this temporary thing? Like, would you then consider this like a permanent institutional setup? And does this matter? Like that's what I'm thinking.
No, that's a great question. So I don't consider it to be permanent institution. Usually what happens is we set up this short-term government and then we replace it through an election. So they can occur at the same time. So you can have a short-term government and then clarify power sharing institutions that are supposed to carry forward into the post-temporary government period. So they can occur at the same time. The intercode reliability statistics shows that they don't really occur very much at the same time. So if the post-war institution, the post-temporary government institutions are meant to be permanent, then it can be institutional power sharing. What I want to look at in the kind of back half of the second application is what happens when we have those deadlines, right? So when we say that we're going to end this government within 3 years of appointing it, do we actually transition to elections within 3 years? In South Sudan's case, the answer is no, they're still running that temporary government, although they arrested one of the vice presidents, so it's not working particularly well right now. but they've delayed multiple times that electrical transition. And that's actually going to be one of my claims, is that there's good reason to expect that we might delay the transition to regular order, because it means an end to this type of government that's giving us power and the ability to award rents.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so now I have the coding. I promised I would do some NLP stuff when I volunteered to give the talk. So we're going to show some validation of the coding. So I want to be clear here. I get this question sometimes of, isn't this just kind of repeating the same point that you've already made, right? And the goal here, because it's just me and I established the coding rules, what I want to show for you is that the coding rules are consistently applied and reasonable and can be learned through machine learning. And because if I've done a good job applying them, because anybody who's done qualitative coding knows that sometimes it's you have scope creep, right? Or things change, or the order in which you read the documents matters. And then you have to be very, very careful to ensure consistent application of your coding rules. And so I'm just trying to prove to you that I have consistent application of the coding rules. So the two validation exercises that I propose in the paper are using word embeddings to illustrate that within these two types of documents, the meaning of the same word differs. And so we're going to use word embeddings to learn that difference. And then that I can get a random forest to learn the distinction between temporary power sharing and no power sharing. Unfortunately, the small number of institutional agreements, what I'd love to do is show you that it can learn that distinction between institutional and temporary power sharing too, but the small number of agreements in an even smaller number of countries means that I just don't have enough to train something and then test it, because I only have about 18. And once we take into account that we'd like to keep the agreements from the same country in either the test sample or the training sample, but not both, I just don't have enough data to show you anything interesting. Okay, so the embedding method. So I have a problem. I don't have very much data. And word embeddings typically are trained on huge core data, things like Wikipedia, right? So I have an embedding for certain words, like president, right? And I have it because it's been learned from Wikipedia, but I have one embedding. And I want two embeddings. I want to know embedding for president in temporary power sharing agreements. I want to know the embedding for president in institutional power sharing agreements. I want to show you that those are different. I don't have enough data to train two totally new embeddings on power sharing. I do, but I don't have enough data to train high quality embeddings. On power sharing, quality is usually increasing function of number of documents, number of terms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're going to do is what Rodriguez and I'll call a la carte embedding, which is actually not their term, but that's whose notation I'm using. Essentially, and this sounds much more complicated than it is, we're going to take pre-trained embeddings, love in this case. And a word embedding is just a 300-dimensional vector that represents the word in a vector space. And so the reason that we like to do this is because it lets us talk about what terms are near to each other. And this gives us a quantitative measure of meaning, right? So terms that are near to each other mean the same thing. And a quantitative measure of distance, right? So different terms are far from each other, et cetera. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to learn new embeddings in each document type, and I'm going to do that using the embeddings of the surrounding terms. This is very similar to the core idea of embeddings, but it allows you can do it with different data because you're using the pre-trained embeddings for every word except the word that you're interested in learning about. Okay.
What is U sub WI?
So yeah, sure. So this is our embedding. So U sub WI is the glove embedding for the word, for the terms around the word. And then WI is going to be our new embedding. And then we're going to upweight or downweight terms based on their frequency. So essentially what we need to do is say that stop words or common words don't contribute very much to this meaning. And if we keep them at their usual weights, the embeddings will get very close to each other, even though they're not that meaningfully similar because the word the is in there constantly. So what we're going to end up with is WI, which is our new embedding.
Just a quick question. When you say words that are around the other word, in the front and the back, in the same sentence, in the same paragraph?
In this case, it's a context window around the term. So for this specific application, I use 25 words because I think the complicated, so I wanted to catch everything. And I also removed stop words, although the weights matrix should have helped remove that effect, but there's no reason not to remove the stop words in my opinion. And so essentially what we're going to do is we can take this text. So this is from our arcs, and it's a single instance of the term president and the surrounding words. So I pulled out all the stop words, which makes this kind of hard to read. But you can see that it's talking about appointments during the transitional period under consultation from the parties to the. And what we're going to do is we're just going to start with shall, and we're going to replace it with its embedding from glove. So imagine that's a 300 length vector going down. Okay. And then we're just going to keep going, and we'll replace all the words except for president with their embeddings. Right, so now we have a 9 by, I'm only showing 10 because I couldn't get 25 on here. So now I have a 300 by 9 matrix of all the embeddings for all the words around president, right? And I'm just going to take the average, except I messed up my own notation, and that U is supposed to be a W. So ignore the U, it's a W. Oh no, actually, no, I didn't mess my own notation. That's U, I just didn't show all the matrices. So that's our new embedding, but it's unweighted. Right? So that's our what we've learned about president in this case. So we've just taken row-wise averages over these embeddings, right? And so we found in each of the 300 dimensions where this instance of president is located. And then we're going to weight it, and I just didn't show you the full matrices. And then once we weight it, we end up with this, which is the embeddings for all the instances of the term in all of the agreements. And in this case, our example is right, our example is right here among the temporary power sharing agreements. And in the teal, we have the institutional power sharing agreements. And remember what at the beginning I said, what I want to show you is that the meaning of the terms are different, which means the embeddings move apart, right? We started with a single embedding for the term. And what I'd like to show you is that the embeddings for the same term are different in two contexts.
Are the colors the temporary versus?
Yeah, I just don't have a scale. So purple is temporary and the teal is institutional. So you can see we do, and then the large dots, right where the cursor is on the teal one, are the center of the space for those terms. And that's what we're going to use to measure distance between the new embeddings and other words, right? So each of the dots represents an instance and its embedding, and then I've reduced it through UMAP down to a two-dimensional space so that we can look at them. Okay. And then to kind of close the loop, okay. Okay. But I promised meaning, right? Meaning behind the terms. And what I gave you is a long vector of numbers, which is not super helpful. But what it lets us do is it lets us measure the distance between the embedding for president and embeddings for other words. So what words does president share meaning with when it's used in temporary power sharing, and which terms does it share meaning with when it's used in institutional power sharing? And then what we can do is we can use discrimination and identify through cosine similarity between the vectors of the embeddings, right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at which ones have the most, discriminate most between the two meanings. So what terms are most strongly associated with temporary power sharing versus institutional power sharing and vice versa. And this is what we get. And so I think this is in general supportive because it shows when we're talking about temporary power sharing, we're talking about president, we're using it in the same sense as other appointment terms, right? We're talking about vice president, we're talking about chairperson, we're talking about prime ministers, right? We're talking about appointments. When we're talking about institutional, president and institutional power sharing, we're talking about legal reform, right? We're talking about ratification, enacting, we're talking about statutory action, right? And this, to me, indicates that these two meanings are distinct, right? And they align with kind of the meaning that I assigned them at the beginning. Okay. The next validation exercise is the random forest. So the random forest is a really simple learner. Apologies if this is review. What we're going to do is we're going to create a term document matrix out of all of these agreements, right? We're going to remove the stop words, we're going to stem, and we're going to drop very infrequent terms, and we're also going to drop any contextual term. Because what I want to show you is that this distinction can be learned generally from the data and not idiosyncratically from conflict-specific attributes. So it would be very helpful to know that R-arcs was called R-arcs because it contains temporary power sharing. So I can improve model performance, but it's not generalizable, right? It doesn't help very much. So we're going to remove all that. And like I said, I don't have enough institutional power sharing data to do a full analysis of that. This is model performance in the test set. And for reference, I've indexed it against model performance using this exact same procedure, trying to learn the existing power sharing measure from the peace agreement data. When the cells are shaded, it means that the model performed better. And you can see that in general, the random forest learns the temporary power sharing versus no power sharing distinction as well or better than it can learn the UCP power sharing distinction. And I argue in the paper it's because the UCP power sharing distinction kind of measures a larger number of things that are harder to separate. And then if we want to look at variable performance, we can do so through permutations, right? So this is for the model trained to learn temporary power sharing. So what we're doing here is we're taking a variable, which is a row from the term document matrix, and we're permuting it. So we're just replacing it with its own values in different locations, and we're seeing how much worse the model performs when we destroy the information behind that term. And this again seems supportive of the argument because the model struggles when you remove distributional language, right? When you remove seat and name and a point and things like that. The higher, further to the right, the term is, the more that the model performance is harmed by removing that term.
How did you got to remove the contextual words?
So basically, if you imagine you have the rectangular data frame, right? And then in one of the rows, we have opposition for the stem opposite, right? And it has a vector, right? And we basically just randomly sort that. So at a high level, the data is the same, right? We have the same number of variables, but there's no information behind the word opposite anymore because we've broken any association that it has with the outcome after training the model, right? And so then we run it back through the model, and then we see how much worse the model does when it can't use that to learn the distinction. So that way we still have the same data in a general sense, but we've just ideally, and then you repeat it, right? So there's a distribution here. You can repeat the permutation over and over again just because it's not very stable because it depends on where the where the values ended up in the row.
So can you tell us how you interpret those variables? I mean, what do they mean to you?
Yeah, so the variables, to me, it means that if we take away the words like minister, like prime minister, the model performs worse. It's less able to learn the distinction between temporary power sharing and no power sharing. So what that means to me is that they're associated, but it doesn't necessarily tell me, as it would in, say, a regression context, the direction of that association. So we don't get a coefficient, so we don't know the sign, we just know generic model performance, right? So I could be wrong in that removing opposite improves model performance because, damages model performance because opposite or minister are really associated with no power sharing, right? That would mean that I could get this result and still be incorrect if that were the case. But I can also see by drilling down to a specific observation how they affect the prediction and in the direction for that observation. And so this is for our arcs again. And so we have opposition again. And so essentially these are like a first difference. So if we take opposite the stem and we move it from the mean to the observation for our arcs, what happens to the predicted probability of containing temporary power sharing, which is labeled contribution. And again, we can repeat that because the order in which you change the variables matters because they're all interacted because it's a random forest, everything's sequential. And so what this shows me is that if we moved opposite from its mean to the observation for arcs, it increases the predicted probability that the arcs contains power sharing, which suggests a positive correlation, which is what we would like to see if I'm right.
Well, I guess to refine my question, what I'm looking for is how do you look on that list and see something about the content of these variables that informs you about something about the difference between temporary and institutional power sharing?
Yeah, so again, I don't have institutional on this one, unfortunately, so it's really the distinction between temporary and no power sharing.
Oh, okay.
So what it tells me is that when we use these terms, we're likely talking about temporary power sharing versus no power sharing. So when the document contains a high number of instances of prime minister, for example, we're likely talking about appointments, allowing the parties to appoint to prime ministers. We have to do some kind of post-model inference on what the meaning of the terms is. But I think what I would say is that we're talking about appointing prime ministers. We're talking about who gets to appoint those deputy ministers or ministers to parties. And because we know that it's increasing the model's accuracy.
Yeah, we're not talking about what's for dinner or building roads or.
Yes.
something extreme.
So if I were wrong, then these would not appear, right? So we would just see noise likely, right? We would just see random terms because the distinction really doesn't matter. But hopefully, I think that it's the model indicates that the distinction is real, right? The distinction between these two forms.
So Matt,
Yeah.
just to clarify more.
Yeah.
So these are, right, the importance of the term for the classification
Yes. Correct.
performance, right?
Correct.
So that's why you can't speak about increasing or decreasing. It's just specifically about how, like, what contributed to the result of the classification,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, that's right. I can't tell you direction or statistical significance in a meaningful traditional sense.
Right.
I can say only that without the information behind this term, the model performs worse in terms of classification accuracy. Okay. Oh, yes, that's it. So now the question is, so what? I think, right? So I've hopefully convinced you that there's two distinct forms of political power sharing in post-war in the post-war environment, and I think the natural question, and I hopefully have convinced you that with a very brief review, that existing work doesn't really make this distinction, right? But so now I think we're faced with the kind of unpleasant reviewer question of, so what? Why do I care, right? Why does this matter? So I'm hopefully going to convince you through two applications that this affects both post-war stability and post-war politics. So the first application I'm going to look at is rebel group splintering. So this, along with the first section, is an existing working paper. And I build on a second literature that looks at how rebel groups fragment during peace negotiations. And so the core argument here is that you can conceptualize of a rebel group as various sub-commanders and their followers under an overarching umbrella, right? And those sub-commanders or other leaders have divergent preferences over negotiations with the government, right? So they may be hardliners, or they may be spoilers, right? They don't want peace at any cost. Or they may just be myopic, right? They want peace if it benefits them and not if it benefits somebody else. And so what we observe is that when rebel groups enter into negotiation with the government, it puts tons of pressure on these existing cleavages in the movement, and it can result in fragmentation. So one sub-commander takes their followers and leaves the umbrella organization, strikes out as their own group, either because they want a place at the table or because they just fundamentally disagree with the utility of continuing negotiation with the government. What I'm going to argue is that when we establish these temporary power sharing governments, what we're saying is that rebel group leaders have basically a free hand to nominate whoever they would like into this unity government, right? So typically the agreements are extremely, extremely explicit about which group gets to nominate to which positions. But how that nomination process occurs, how that appointment process occurs, is totally up to the specific group that gets the appointment. So in other words, we know that in South Sudan, the SPLM-IO, so Riek Machar's group, gets to appoint a vice president after that sign. That's all we know. There's no distinction, there's no discussion of how that person gets appointed, and it turns out that they appointed Riek Machar, which is probably unsurprising. So the rebel leaders have significant discretion in how they make these appointments, and my argument in this paper is that they should use these appointments, or do use these appointments, as a promise to reward loyalty during the negotiation period. So when we see the rebel group go under this kind of strain when they enter into negotiations, where sub-leaders might consider abandoning the movement, they can be bought off with the promise of a position in the post-war government. Okay? And so that if that's true, what we should see is that when groups are offered this temporary power sharing compared to no power sharing, we should see that they're less likely to fragment during that negotiation process. And so really briefly, and I'm happy to discuss more at the end or now, using observational data on group fragmentation paired with the new kind of, I've moved this temporary power sharing data into panel data to show which groups are getting offered this type of power sharing at what point in time. We can, and then using two-way fixed effects models, we can see that when a group is offered temporary power sharing compared to an agreement without power sharing, so this is the difference down here, they are less likely to fragment by about 5%, which indicates that that mechanism could be at play, this idea of rewarding loyalty in the post-war period. And then the second application, so this is more work in progress that we're currently trying to get some seed funding for to develop additional data collection that we use to speak to this post-war democratization question. So I highlighted this briefly when I talked in the working group previously, but essentially there's an existing debate on how post-war power sharing affects long-term democratization. Hartzell and Hoedigan are probably the most recent last word in this, and they're arguing that we see a top-down and a bottom-up effect of power sharing on democratization. On the at the top level, we mitigate some of the uncertainty about elections for post-war leaders. So we know that there's going to continue to be some level of associationalism, even if we hold elections. So the threat of holding elections and possibly losing power is less frightening because there's going to continue to be some level of access to the government. And at the bottom up level, because we're engaging in this type of political process, we're building trust in the central government. And the counterpoint is that consociationalism is inherently anti-majoritarian, right? We often are overrepresented by smaller groups in the state in order to ensure that we can continue to run this kind of great push. What I argue here is that we're kind of fundamentally missing the point again, because we're still talking about institutional forms of power sharing that we're not really using. And what we want to talk about is short-term power sharing instead, because that's what everybody's actually implementing in the post-war period. And so kind of the initial sketch of the theory, right? I expect that this temporary power sharing government looks a lot like contested authoritarianism, right? So you've established a number of different actors in the government with really limited institutional guardrails whom will probably try to consolidate power against each other by removing rivals from the government and taking over, right? And at the same time, I expect that you have strong incentives to delay the eventual transition to, it's usually elections, transition to a regular political process, because a large portion of these positions are actually only available during the short-term government. So, right, South Sudan doesn't have 4 vice presidents moving forward. It just currently has 4 vice presidents. But when we return to normal institutions, we're going to consolidate down to a smaller number of vice presidents. And when the elections happen, we kind of break the hold that the former armed actors have over the appointment process, right? So instead of getting to appoint legislators to the central legislature, they get to be elected now. So I think we embed strong reasons for armed actors, once they're in power, to delay holding elections that would remove them from power. So the proposal, so Dimitri and I proposed this for some seed funding, so we're hoping to hear positive results on that sometime soon. is that we're going to use human in the loop method to extract additional data from the corpus of peace agreements beyond the kind of simple embeddings and random forest that I showed you in the first section. So what I really want to know, so what I have is a binary coding, right? Temporary, institutional, power sharing, both or none. And what I want is a huge amount of contextual information that I want to extract from these agreements that would be very time consuming for me to do as a human. Including the parties, the institutions, if we're developing institutional power sharing, who gets to appoint what positions in the temporary government, and how long until we're supposed to replace this temporary government with the regularly scheduled, with a regular election. And then once I know that, I want to know who are we actually appointing to these positions, right? So who do the armed actors move into the legislature? Who do they appoint as the minister for petroleum? Okay, so I show really briefly here with the Pretoria Agreement, which was 2002 attempt to resolve the Second Congo Civil War, how well an LLM with zero-shot prompting can extract this information from the agreement, right? So if I pass it the agreement unaltered, how much, and ask it to tell me which parties we can nominate to which positions in the government, how well can it perform? This one I already know the answer to. It's temporary power sharing agreement. So we have 4 vice presidents, a president, and then other executive positions, and then we're going to create a bicameral legislature, and then we're going to point into that. And the LLM actually does fairly well. It makes 2 mistakes, which I'm showing you in the yellow and the red. The first is that the incoming government also got a vice president, and it missed that when it was extracting the positions from the agreement, and that civil society actors were allowed to appoint 4, not 3 deputy ministers. But the rest of the information is accurate, and the LLM seemingly is well positioned to perform this kind of extractive summarization of the agreement. But, you know, we don't want 88% accuracy, we'd like 100% accuracy, so we're going to allow a human annotator to review the agreement because it's easier to check whether information is right than to extract it at the beginning. And then once we're confident that that distribution of positions, for example, is correct, we can ask it to draw on secondary information and tell us, well, who filled those positions, right? So this is the president and vice president for the major armed actors after the Pretoria Agreement. And I asked the LLM again with zero-shot prompting to tell me who got appointed and how long they were in office. And I'm curious about something like authoritarian consolidation. I want to know if they left unexpectedly. And similarly, I validated all of this with secondary sources, and it's largely, well, no, entirely correct. It gets the correct appointees. It successfully distinguishes between Kabila and the vice presidents taking office at different times, and they all continue to hold office until the end of the transitional period in December 2006. And it also correctly extracted from the agreement, but I don't have the table to show you, that the transition period was supposed to run to July 2006, not December, but they extended it.
Which LLM?
This was Gemini Pro because it was easily available, but I think we will likely do some testing when we're developing the methodology and try to see what does the best at extracting this information. And again, we're going to need to have human validation of this, of these results as well, right? And then once we collect all of this information, I think we have a large number of downstream applications that I think really interesting, right? We can talk about how long it takes to transition to elections and how closely we adhere to electoral timelines when we implement this type of power sharing versus not, right? If I'm right about delaying elections, we should be able to see it. We can also see about vote fairness, political violence around elections, and whether the sides accept that outcome of the election. We can look at patronage appointments into the government, right? So we have all these appointees. We can see who did the appointing, and we can actually build a network to show that. And then we can look at consolidation as well as long-term normalization through forecasting. That's the whole talk. Thank you all so much for your time and attention. I really appreciate it.